They say nations fall slowly, one ruined decision at a time. But the truth is far darker, because the countries we think are powerful, proud, and independent have been trapped in a silent war for decades, a war without bullets or bombs, a war fought with invisible chains made of debt, interest, and economic manipulation. And the strangest part is that almost nobody notices, because this war leaves no smoke, no explosions, and no bodies to bury, only broken economies, collapsing currencies, and generations born already carrying financial shackles they never chose. And when we talk about countries like Pakistan, India, Egypt, and Turkey, nations with rich histories, cultures, and civilizations older than most Western powers, we find a pattern so terrifying that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Because these countries did not just accidentally end up in debt. They were designed, forced, manipulated, trapped, and cornered into it through a centuries-old system engineered to control them forever. And it all begins long before modern borders were even drawn, long before flags were raised, long before independence was celebrated, back in the era when colonial empires did not just conquer land, they conquered wealth, resources, gold, agriculture, industry, and most importantly, they conquered the financial future of every nation they touched. When colonial powers like the British Empire, French Empire, and Ottoman remnants dominated these regions, they extracted everything: gold from India, cotton and grain from Egypt, soldiers and raw materials from Pakistan's regions, and strategic trade routes from Turkey, turning these lands into engines of wealth, but engines that powered someone else's machine while leaving the local populations with barely anything. And when independence finally arrived in the 20th century, the world celebrated, but nobody realized the deeper truth. Independence was political, not economic. Flags changed, leaders changed, borders changed, but the financial system stayed exactly the same because the colonizers left behind broken economies, damaged infrastructure, unequal trade structures, and weak political foundations, ensuring that the newly independent nations would immediately need loans just to survive their first breaths of freedom, and the moment they borrowed, the trap closed. Pakistan inherited a country with almost no industry, no capital reserves, no functional banking system, and massive refugee inflows, forcing it to borrow from Western lenders and international institutions within its first year. India inherited a looted economy where Britain had drained trillions over 2 centuries, leaving poverty and instability. Egypt inherited a nation crippled by colonial-built debt and forced agricultural monoculture, making it dependent on imports. Turkey inherited the remains of a collapsed empire surrounded by enemies and internal instability. So these nations borrowed again and again, signing agreements they didn't fully understand, accepting conditions they couldn't control, entering programs designed not to help them grow, but to keep them weak, obedient, and dependent. As decades passed, the debt system evolved into a more sophisticated trap. International lenders gave loans with interest rates far higher than Western countries pay. They forced policy changes, currency devaluations, subsidy cuts, tax increases, measures that hit the poor hardest and weakened domestic industries. They demanded privatization of national assets, meaning airports, railways, oil companies, and power plants often ended up under foreign control. They created cycles in which countries paid more interest than the original loan amount. And whenever a country struggled to repay, the lenders offered new loans to pay old loans, increasing debt instead of reducing it. This is why Pakistan has gone to the IMF more than 20 times. This is why India borrows domestically at massive levels. This is why Egypt repeatedly collapses into inflation. This is why Turkey constantly battles currency freefall. But debt alone is not the full story. Internal corruption plays a huge part. Politicians in these nations often misuse funds, inflate project costs, and borrow for personal or political gain. Infrastructure projects are announced with big promises, but half remain incomplete, leaving behind massive loans with no financial return. Bureaucracies are inefficient, tax systems are weak, and economic planning is often short-term and politically motivated rather than strategically designed. Industries remain outdated because investment is low. Agriculture suffers due to lack of technology. Energy dependency drains billions in foreign exchange. Trade deficits grow because these countries import far more than they export. Pakistan imports fuel, machinery, electronics, chemicals, even food, spending billions while exporting little. India imports huge amounts of oil, technology, and defense equipment. Egypt imports wheat, fuel, and manufactured goods. Turkey imports energy, raw materials, and industrial inputs. This imbalance creates perpetual dollar shortages. When dollars vanish, currencies fall. When currencies fall, debt rises. When debt rises, governments borrow more. And the cycle continues endlessly. Foreign influence also plays a major role. Powerful countries use debt as a weapon. They give loans not for development, but for geopolitical control. They influence foreign policy through financial leverage. They push nations into alliances, military agreements, and trade deals by controlling their economic lifeline. They dictate economic reforms that benefit global corporations rather than local populations. They demand access to strategic ports, trade routes, natural resources, and political alignment. They use rating agencies, financial media, and global institutions to pressure nations into compliance. And while these external forces tighten their grip, internal challenges multiply. Rapid population growth increases demand for food, energy, water, jobs, healthcare, and infrastructure. Governments spend more than they earn. Tax evasion is massive. Wealth inequality grows. Elites grow richer while the poor suffer. The middle class shrinks. Inflation rises. Unemployment spreads. And people lose hope. All the while, global financial markets remain dominated by the US dollar, giving the United States enormous power. Whenever the US raises interest rates, the entire world suffers. Dollars become expensive. Loans become harder to repay. Foreign investors pull money out of developing countries. Currencies collapse. Stock markets fall. Inflation rises. And debt payments skyrocket. Pakistan, India, Egypt, and Turkey all suffer whenever the dollar strengthens. Add to this the impact of oil prices. None of these nations produce enough energy to meet their needs. They rely heavily on imported oil and gas. When global oil prices rise, their budgets collapse. Fuel becomes expensive. Transportation costs increase. Food prices rise. Electricity becomes costly. Inflation spikes. Governments struggle to subsidize energy. And debt increases again. And then there is the issue of leadership. Many leaders in these nations make emotional, political, or rushed decisions rather than strategic ones. They borrow to win elections. They print money to cover budget gaps. They ignore long-term planning. They mismanage crises. They fail to reform tax systems. They fail to build sustainable industries. They fail to invest in education and technology. And so the debt grows. The worst part is that ordinary citizens pay the price. Prices rise, jobs vanish, savings disappear, currencies collapse, businesses shut down, poverty increases, and people are forced to leave their countries to survive. But there is still one deeper, darker truth, one that almost nobody accepts. The global financial system is designed so that rich countries stay rich and poor countries stay in debt forever. When poor nations struggle, the interest payments alone become a steady income stream for powerful financial institutions. Debt becomes profit. Poverty becomes business. Crisis becomes opportunity. And this is why countries like Pakistan, India, Egypt, and Turkey remain in debt, not because they are weak, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack resources, but because they are trapped in a global financial architecture built to ensure that they never truly become independent.